If you are white, do you think having a black friend or partner exempts you from being a racist? And if you are black, have you ever met a white liberal who you knew was racist, but they denied it based on their list of black bona fides? Today, we are talking about how to know if you are a racist or if the person sitting next to you on your job is a racist. All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
For the last year and a half, America has been having a nationwide conversation about race and structural racism. Though some people may be new to this conversation, there are scholars, black and white alike, that have been writing about and speaking up about these issues for decades. Joining me today for an exclusive one-on-one interview is one of those scholars. Dr. Robin DiAngelo is an associate professor at the University of Washington. She's a consultant and facilitator on racial and social justice issues. She is also the author of multiple books, including her groundbreaking book, White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism, which in 2021 entered its third year on the New York Times best-selling list. Her latest book, also a New York Times bestseller, is Nice Racism: How Progressive White People Perpetuate Racial Harm. Good morning and welcome to the show, Dr. DiAngelo.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
I am just super excited to sit down with you. I have been an avid follower of the work that you've been doing. We have friends in common, Dr. Michael Dyson, Eric Dyson. I'm getting his name wrong. But, we have a lot of friends in common. We are passionate about some of the same issues, which is social justice. And your book, White Fragility, my goodness, New York Times best-selling list for the third year, number one on that list. Did you have any idea when you wrote that book, about 5 years ago, that it would have the success that it's had?
Well, I couldn't have imagined it. So no, on one level. On another level, I knew there was an audience for it. And that's because it's based on an original article I wrote in 2011, so a decade ago, an academic article I really didn't think anybody read. You know how they get tucked away in journals and only graduate students come across them. But somebody quoted from that article quite extensively in an op-ed, and it went viral. And I began to get emails from around the world from people saying, you have put into words and language something that I've either experienced or something that I recognize that I perpetuate. And so I wanted to make it more accessible and get it into the mainstream. And again, no, I couldn't imagine it would have this kind of reception.
And I know that sales skyrocketed after George Floyd's murder last year in May, as the country really started to focus on issues of structural racism, particularly in the criminal justice system and in policing. And the book, became a number one bestseller on the list, beating out Hunger Games. So all of a sudden, people, are picking up a book about race and racism. And to be honest, this isn't an easy read if you are a white person.
Yeah, it was a time when more white people, what we might say the mainstream of white people, it came on their radar in a way that was undeniable. That video, that 9.5 seconds of George Floyd's execution, you just couldn't say maybe he did something. It was, again, undeniable. And while Black people have been speaking out and pushing white people to see this for a long time, unfortunately, the nature of implicit bias is we don't always listen to Black people. And so this kind of mainstream white population was looking for guidance, help me understand this. And they were open to understanding it. And I think just the convergence of that moment and the fact that I'm an insider. Like, I want to be really clear. I could not understand what I understand today if I had not listened to and been mentored by and educated by Black people. And I don't think white people can understand racism if we're not listening to Black people. But there's a piece that I have that you don't have, right? And that is the insider's experience. And it's actually harder to deny when someone who shares your experience is naming that in a way that you have to recognize.
So help us understand, when we think of the word fragility, you might think of weakness, right? I mean, right. You look up the word in the dictionary, that's what you're going to find. But when you use the term white fragility, you're not talking about weakness. Help us understand for you what white fragility means.
Yeah, and I think that people who don't know my work or haven't read it hear that and think, oh, I'm saying be careful, white people have delicate sensibilities. Well, on the one hand, we do. So the fragility is meant to capture how little it takes to cause white people to melt down on racism. But the impact of the meltdown isn't fragile at all because it marshals behind it the weight of history, of institutional power, of legal authority. And in that way, it's actually an incredibly effective mechanism for social control. There's a question I often ask white people of color when I'm in front of them back in the day. How often have you attempted to give a white person feedback on their unaware but inevitable racist frameworks, assumptions, behaviors, and have that go well for you? Mm-hmm. And there's laughter, there's eye rolling. And the number one answer I've gotten from Black people, how well does it go when you try to talk to white people about what we're doing, intentionally or not, that's problematic? And the number one answer is it's never gone well. And the number two is rarely gone well. And so it functions as a kind of, I'm going to be blunt here, a kind of white racial bullying. We make it so punitive and miserable for you to go there with us. All too often, it actually gets worse for you when you challenge a white person. It doesn't get better for you. And so the choice a lot of Black folks make, and white people who want to speak up, is just, I'll let it go. I won't say anything. And so it's very powerful. Think about it more like broken glass.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you say that white fragility is actually weaponized. You call it a white arsenal, a means of protecting a frail moral ego and defending a righteous self-image. And you say ultimately this perpetuates racial hierarchy. I was really intrigued by your chapter in White Fragility on what you call white women's tears. Mm-hmm. Why that chapter and why that title?
Well, in fairness, I'm not the first person who's written about white women's tears. I may be the first who's written about it from the white kind of angle as a white woman, because it's a really common dynamic. Certainly, white men manifest white fragility, but given gender socialization, it doesn't always look the same. We've seen it countless times on videos. A white woman is confronted with her racist behavior, and she bursts into tears. And typically what happens is everyone rallies around her as the victim. Police show up. Who's going to be believed as the perpetrator or the aggressor, and who's going to be the victim? There's a deep history of women, white women, claiming racial distress. Emmett Till is a tragic example of what happens when white women weaponize those tears. And I don't want to be misunderstood that I'm saying white women should never cry. Right. I think in some ways, all of us who are white should be asking ourselves, why are our hearts not breaking at the depth of systemic racism in this country? Why are we not moved? Why did it take that video of George Floyd to move us, right? But our tears have an impact. There's a social impact to those tears. And so how, when, why we're crying, we need to be attentive to.
And, it's such an interesting point, Dr. DiAngelo, because I'm thinking of all these Karen videos, right? All these videos that we see on the internet that go viral. There was one recently of a white woman in a Victoria's Secret, I think it was in New Jersey.
I saw it.
Yeah, I remember the Black woman is videotaping her, and this woman is just having a complete meltdown. And as you said, the other shoppers in the store immediately tell the black woman, why don't you stop filming her? You're making her upset. You're making this worse, rather than asking the white woman to calm down. There's nothing happening to you. She's across the store. She's nowhere near you. So that reaction, do you think white women are raised to know the power of that kind of reaction? Like, how would the woman know that she could react in that way and cause people to rally around her?
Oh, that's a great question. And there's so much in that little story, that the way that you just shared it. So let me, no particular order, hit a few things. First of all, notice that, I mean, if there was not a racial dynamic involved, and that woman behaved like that in the store, she would be removed. I can't imagine you could lay on the floor and scream and not be removed from a store. But there's a racial dynamic. I mean, that's the power of that. So that if it's a black woman involved, then there must be something she should do to change her behavior. And it's kind of reminiscent of, well, they shouldn't have run. What did they do to cause a harsher than we might expect response? Part of white entitlement is not having to know, on the one hand, not having to know that she risked that black woman potentially being killed. When Amy Cooper called the police, she knew perfectly well that Chris Cooper might have died that day. On the one hand, who doesn't know that? And yet you do have to ask yourself, why isn't knowing that enough to have you intervene on behalf of the black woman? There's a kind of apathy, I think, on the part of kind of white culture that just consistently does not privilege the experiences of black people.
Yeah. No, and if you're African American, you've had that experience. I've told the story on the show before of me standing in a line, when COVID had really long lines, you couldn't get into stores, and a white woman came to the front of the line and wanted to get in, and everyone says, well, just let her in. So I'm like, well, okay, well, I've been standing here for an hour. What is it about her just needing her urgency, her emergency, that's more important than me and everyone else that's been in this line? And I said something to the store clerk, and he said, this happens all day. He says, I don't even feel like I can approach my manager about it, because these are our clients. They value them as shoppers. And implicit in that was they value them more than they value me as a shopper. And he said, basically, they weren't going to do anything about it, and he had just resigned himself to that was the way this was going to happen.
Yeah, and I'm going to say something again that may sound harsh, and I suspect you'll understand, and if not, certainly call me to attention around it. But the absence of black people is what defines the quality of white space. The fewer black people in that space, the higher quality it will be perceived to have. So, for example, good schools. What's a good school? Come on, it's a white school. What's a good neighborhood? When somebody says, oh my God, you never thought that would happen in this neighborhood. Okay, what neighborhood are we talking about? And the higher the concentration of black people, the less status it is perceived to have in the white mind. So there could be, conscious or not, a place where it's okay if you don't shop there. That will, give more status to our store.
And definitely, I think there was a sense of, we see more white shoppers in this store than black shoppers. This is some high-end, tennis shoe store. So we're going to cater to, the people that we see in these spaces more, and that's white people. I do want to ask you, though, about this class thing, because I know, grew up with a single mother, and you said you guys were, low income family, definitely, not a family of means, but you make the point that classism shouldn't be confused with racism.
No. We can say that's all rooted in the distribution of resources, but we're not going to get rid of racism by eliminating classism. We might ameliorate some of the burden of systemic discrimination on black people by lessening economic disparity. But poor white people don't have any less racism than poor black people. So in other words, I grew up poor, homelessness, foster care, a very deep sense of shame as a child about that poverty. And I also always knew I was white, and I always knew that it was better to be white. And being white absolutely has helped me navigate poverty. I don't know how anyone can, look me honestly in the eyes and say to be poor and white and poor and black is the same experience. It's not. Racism is still at play. And we can go the other end. Barack Obama was arguably the most powerful person, certainly in the country, if not the world, economically quite secure, and endured levels of racism that were stunning. It didn't protect him from experiencing racism.
Yeah, no, and obviously I lived in both of those worlds, abject poverty as a kid and then, a graduate of an Ivy League institution. So definitely know both ends of that. Your book, though, falls into this category of scholarship called whiteness studies. How is that different from critical race theory? I was trying to, make sure I understood the differences.
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, whiteness studies came out around the 90s. I actually am not sure exactly what field of scholarship it came out of, but for a very long time, Black scholars were saying, stop studying us. Our problem is you, study yourselves. Okay. Early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, some scholars began to take up that charge and say, well, what does it mean to be white? Let's look at white culture, white norms. Let's look at white supremacy as the foundation. And so whiteness studies. Critical race theory, I suppose they're connected in some of their basic tenets, but it came out of legal scholarship. And it was a framework for understanding why, regardless of a law or policy that appears to be objective and impacting everybody equally, do we have such astounding disparity? Is racism systemically embedded in the criminal justice system? Today, well, there are people who would say it isn't, but I don't think they're playing in fair faith. So that's certainly, by borrowing that framework and saying, because I am in the field of education, and saying, okay, how is systemic racism embedded in education? Right. So you're borrowing that framework to make an examination of a particular institution.
Now, I know we talked at the beginning of the interview about the impact that George Floyd's murder had on, the surge in sales for your books and the demand, by corporations that you come in and give, these diversity and equity trainings. But also, if we look back to 2014 with the Michael Brown killing by police in Ferguson, I know that you said that was a period where liberals were starting to examine this whole concept of being allies, to really look at what that felt like and what that should look like. But I also read that you said that you remain somewhat skeptical that white people, whatever their politics, are genuinely willing to, in some ways, surrender the power that they have as a result of their whiteness. Is that your opinion today?
Well, it doesn't look like we demonstrate allyship very consistently. There are polls that show that a lot of people who got involved after George Floyd's murder are no longer particularly interested. So there's these surges of interest that don't get sustained. I mean, if I didn't think we could do better, if I didn't think there was hope, I wouldn't be able to do what I do. But we can never be complacent about it. And I think one of the challenges is that we tend to think about it as an either or proposition. I'm racist or I'm not racist, which means I'm bad or I'm good. And if I'm good, I'm good. And so there's not an issue here and there's nothing more I need to do. So that kind of complacency sets us up for all kinds. I mean, look where we are in this society at this moment. So while I strive to be an ally, I do not believe it can ever be a self-anointed term. So let me give you an example. Have you ever seen a man wearing a T-shirt that says, "This is what a feminist looks like," or something like that, feminist, and on the one hand, I think, okay, that's pretty cool. I mean, that's a pretty brave T-shirt for that dude to wear. And the other hand, I'm saying, yeah, I'll be the judge of that, buddy. Like how many, men who say they're feminist.
Actions speak louder than words and slow.
Yeah, no kidding. And it's the same for allyship. It's really for people of color to determine if in any given moment, am I behaving right now in allied ways? And I'm the least likely to make that determination. I'm the most invested in not seeing my collusion. And so rather than an either or, I find it much more useful to think about it as a continuum. Racism is not going to end in my lifetime. And I'm on that, we're all on that continuum in different ways. So in some moments, I'm kind of further towards the less racist side. And some moments I choose, comfort and solidarity, and I'm on the more racist side. And I think that's more useful than thinking of it as a destination that you have arrived at and you are now complete.
How influenced, Dr. DiAngelo, has your work been? I know you talked about Black scholars. I know Derek Bell, late Professor Derek Bell, Harvard Law professor, influenced your work. But what about Jane Elliott and Peggy McIntosh? Have they, these are white women older than you, but who have been, speaking out about white privilege? Peggy McIntosh, her knapsack, article that has become, iconic piece of literature to read in the context of this anti-racist, conversation that we're having. Have they influenced you, in what ways?
Oh, absolutely. And I appreciate you bringing them up and naming them because, there has been a lot of pressure on white people involved in this work to acknowledge our mentors of color. And so sometimes we can do that and not acknowledge, and there have been people that share our identity that have been profoundly influential. I can tell you exactly where I was sitting when I read Peggy McIntosh's article because I had an out-of-body experience. I did. And it might be so simple and obvious to you. But when I read that list, I can't even describe it other than like being a fish that got taken out of water you didn't know you were in. And I remember thinking, I don't want to go outside because I'm so white and everybody can see it. Right. It was really powerful. Jane Elliott, I'm in awe of. People think I'm confrontational. She's, I just talk about.
I've had her on the show several times. She's a pistol.
She is a pistol, and I did acknowledge in my new book white scholars and activists who have influenced me, including Peggy McIntosh, and I was remiss by not mentioning Jane Elliott. But I deeply admire her. I used her videos when I was teaching classes.
Yeah, well, shout out to Jane and Peggy.
Mm-hmm.
I've had the opportunity to interview Peggy myself. I didn't really know about Peggy's work, and I was invited to a panel on white privilege, and I sat next to her on this panel. It was on the Dr. Phil show, and to prepare for the show, I had to read that article, and myself, as a Black woman, I was like, damn, she's right. It's a profound, anyone who hasn't read Peggy McIntosh, Google her, get this article. It will change your life, like Dr. DiAngelo and I are saying. I want to move on, though, to your book, the new book, Nice Racism, How Progressive White People Perpetuate Racial Harm. I think this is like, white fragility obviously is everything, but this is the next, I guess, level, and you build upon white fragility in this book. And I live in California, so I find books that talk about white liberals particularly interesting because I live in this blue state, but yet we have so much segregation, and the state is so racist in so many ways, and I encounter so many racist people, even though people, think of California as the land of, I don't know, milk and honey. So why this book, and why at this time? Because it just came out,
Yeah, it did. I think maybe it seems soon because white fragility is still quite popular, but it's been 3 years, and I wanted to take a deeper dive and work, if you will, with an audience that already is starting from the assumption that systemic racism exists and they've been shaped by it. That's what I had to seek to establish in White Fragility, to push white people out of denial that they could be free of this system and be unaffected by it. So if you're with me there, I make a provocative claim in White Fragility that I don't answer and that I get asked about a lot. And that is, I think white progressives might actually cause the most daily harm. And so this book sets out to answer that question. How do we do that? My socialization into this system, my racism, doesn't look like white nationalists. All right, I'm not a white nationalist. racist, but it looks like something. So, it's on me to try to identify, well, what does my inversion look like and how can I change that? I mean, you've articulated, there's a theme that I hear from Black people, particularly that are in primarily white. They're surrounded by white people who see themselves as progressive. And that theme is exhaustion. It's harder to get your hands on.
Yeah.
Lots of Black folks have said to me, oh, white nationalists, I know where they're coming from. It's right there. I know how to protect myself. But this smile, while I'm getting undermined in every turn and I can't name it, that's debilitating.
Yeah, and I love you challenge us in this book to really examine this notion that being a nice guy means that you're not a racist, and you help us understand that's kind of the go-to, that's the default position of white liberals often, is that I have a Black partner, I live in a diverse neighborhood, I had a Black roommate, I go to drinks with a Black guy, I listen to Michael Jackson. They have all of these like bona fides that check all these boxes to say I can't be a racist because look at all of this stuff that I do. Help us understand how that is just so wrong.
Yeah, you set me up really nicely there. Thank you. The first thing I would ask any white person to do, particularly if they're feeling defensive about what I'm saying, is to ask yourself, what is the criteria by which I would grant that somebody's racist? And if you use the evidence that you hold up all the time to establish that you're not racist, well, that evidence will give you some clues to what you think a racist is. So apparently a racist can't live in certain places. They can't live in Canada. No racists in Canada. They can't live in New York or any large urban city. Racists can't speak lots of languages. Racists can't, interact politely with Black people, and so on, right? So it often comes down to proximity. Yes. This idea that if I can tolerate proximity, well, you know what? There's a lot of men that can tolerate proximity to women, and I would say they are sexist, right? Proximity does not free us of our conditioning. The other place we go is, well, okay, I know I acted that way, but my true heart is this. Well, whatever your true heart is, that's kind of for me, a nonsensical. What is that? And it is your action that matters, not what you claim is in your true heart. And lastly, I do want to say, because you use the term us, and I just want to be really clear because I think it's important that the book is written from a white person to white people. I'm really glad it was valuable to you, but it's very specifically a message for other white people. I'm not trying to teach about Black people. I'm trying to teach about ourselves in relationship to Black people.
But here's why the book, I think, is so important for Black people. And I appreciate you making that distinction and making that clear. But what you just said for Black people is incredibly frustrating because when it's not the white supremacists, and we can, as you said, call it out because it's not so in your face, so overt racism. And it is these more subtle forms that we experience, these microaggressions that we've been talking a lot about, that we don't know how to label. We don't know how to identify. This book helps us, and it validates that we're not crazy. Because, you'll be in one of these meetings and that's happening to you, and you'll say, well, that's the nice person, right? That's the liberal. I'm at the National Democratic Convention, so, we're all Dems, right? We're all liberals. But you know that what you're experiencing is a form of racism. So that's why I think your writings and your work is so important to Black people, because it helps us, like I said, validate that we're not crazy when we see racists who are nice people.
I appreciate knowing that. Thank you. I'm so glad. I'm so heartened to know that that's
no, because we're also raised in the same white supremacist gaze that you're talking about. Hello, that's the same world that we've been raised in. And for years, if I saw an interracial couple, I would automatically assume that white person who's married to that Black man, or that white person who has a friend, could not be racist. Until I really experienced it in my family. And I had a family member, a male, who was involved with a white woman, and the woman is racist as a racist can be. She loved that one black male in my family, but the rest of us she had contempt for, she had disdain for, but I didn't recognize that because then I was taught to she had to be liberal because she's with this black man.
Yeah, I actually take that on in this book. I have a section called Common Moves or Patterns of White People. It's the ways we try to establish that we're not racist. And one of them is making sure everyone knows you're married to a black man. And again, it's not that that isn't a potentially rich source of understanding, but I say potential because it doesn't automatically mean that. And too often white women will, that's the first thing they want you to know, which kind of functions like a barrier, right? I've told you I'm not racist, and so I'm not going to be open to any feedback to the contrary, right? Yeah.
And same thing with friends, obviously, white people that want you to know they have black friends, or, you know, they do things that are quote unquote, you know, stereotypically black. Maybe they like soul food or something. I don't know. Fried chicken and beef. I don't know. But they, you know, they give you this evidence, which is no evidence at all. I was reading some of the critique of your work, and, you know, I know you get tons of hate mail. Jane tells me that, you know, sometimes she has to just tune it all out. People find her and they, you know, attack her viciously. And I know you've gotten some vicious attacks. Some of them say that, you know, your book oversimplifies, you know, race. I even read a critique that the number of complaints to the EEOC are down, so therefore racism could not be as big of an issue in this country as people like you are making it out to be. Okay, stupid response, but I thought I'd tell you that. But one of the ones I did read over and over again from a lot of white, particularly conservatives, was that your book labels everyone that's white a racist. How do you respond to that?
Well, let's start with what is the criteria by which you would grant that somebody is racist. And the mainstream criteria, the one that I was taught and that I think those folks are operating from, is a racist is someone who doesn't like people based on race, knows that, so it's conscious, and is intentionally mean to them. And I don't know that you could set up a more effective way to protect systemic racism than that simplistic definition. So if that's what I meant when I said, and let me put it the way I say it, all white people have internalized racist ideology. All white people have internalized a racist framework for making meaning and navigating the world. And all white people benefit from and collude in the system of racism. Systemic racism is well observed, described, documented. It's clear. Right. So if I was saying that you intentionally, consciously don't like people based on race, then I would agree that that would be an offensive thing to say. I'm not talking about intentional conscious dislike. I'm talking about socialization into a system that automatically reproduces inequality.
Yeah. One of the other chapters in the book that I was really intrigued by, that resonated with me, is the how you explore white feminism. We know that historically there's been, you know, conflict between African-American women and white feminists. And you give an example of a white feminist group that you spoke to. Tell us a little about that experience. These women who left the talk before you were finished because they were offended by your comments.
Well, I do have a chapter called "We're Not Really That Nice," and you may have noticed if you just scratch lightly on the surface of one of these nice people who's telling you how open-minded they are, you don't have to scratch very hard, and a lot of anger, resentment comes out. So this was a big conference on racial justice, and we broke into what's called affinity groups, where you separate by race so that you can talk about what's specific to your group. So I'm in a room filled with white women. We're all there at a racial justice conference. We can assume we're progressives on the same page. I had them do an exercise based on Peggy McIntosh's work. Make a list of privileges you take for granted. And this one group reads their list out and then I guess felt compelled to tie it with a nice bow and said, but, we're all mothers potentially, and motherhood is the universal experience. And I don't know that there's a starker example of not a universal experience across race than motherhood.
Yeah.
Because we could literally predict whether you and your mother and me and my mother were going to survive our births based on the fact of our racial assignment. It's deep. You know this.
Yeah.
And so I shared that with them. They did not like that. And they en masse left the conference and had somebody let me know that they were offended and they weren't coming back.
Has that happened to you before, where you've talked to these so-called white progressives and you touch a nerve and it causes them to have that kind of reaction?
Yeah, I don't want to have people think that these sessions are always confrontational and people are storming out. And it stood out to me. But yes, of course, it does happen. I tell a story in White Fragility about somebody who was given feedback by a Black facilitator on something problematic she had said. And she left the room, and some messengers came back and said that she may be having a heart attack up at her desk. We had to go like
what a way to lay something on a person. You just caused her to have a heart attack. You just killed her, right?
Like, literally? Are you? No, really, we think she might be having a heart attack. Okay, so White Fragility.
And she didn't. Hopefully, she's fine.
No, she survived.
Thank you.
Having the feedback. And let me say, some defensiveness is natural. Yeah. Some guilt is natural. It's defensiveness and guilt that you don't move through and that you use to excuse not moving through. How many times have you seen this from a white person? Well, fine. If I can't say anything right, I'm not saying anything at all.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I refuse any further growth or openness. I'm not going to listen. I'm going to protect a very limited worldview. That's when it becomes white fragility.
Well, Dr. DiAngelo, you've sold over 1 million copies of White Fragility, and I don't know how many hundreds of thousands, if not millions.
Not yet.
Well, on its way, hopefully, reaching those numbers. So obviously, readers are connecting with this idea that white people need to accept their role in systemic racism. But you're out there talking to some of the biggest companies in the country. I read Google and Apple, and I may be getting the names wrong, but there's some of the big Fortune 500 companies. You're going in, talking to their staff, decision makers inside these companies. Are you seeing any change?
Yeah, it's another great question. At first, I would say, I just think it's worth noting that until the success of White Fragility, I've not been in the corporate world. This is new to me. I was typically in nonprofit and educational settings. So I'm somewhat new. It's a little harder to have a big picture. What I would say is, if it is not sustained, it isn't going to make much of a difference. Always hearing a counter narrative, being educated is always a good thing. But if you think you're going to change a culture by a one-time workshop, and so that's the challenge, that it doesn't become just a we've checked the box kind of thing, that it is sustained in a range of ways, right?
Have you had Black scholars say to you, great, you're doing this work, great, you're getting these corporate jobs, but we've been in this space forever trying to, deliver these same messages. Mm-hmm. And maybe feel some resentment that you're having, this success, 1 million plus copies of your book, New York Times best-selling list, corporations clamoring to have you come speak. Are there white, scholars in the same space saying it took a white woman to tell white people that they're racist before they would accept it? I've been raising my hand for, 2 decades saying you're racist, and I've been, overlooked and rejected.
Yes, and this is one of the deep tensions of this work. Unfortunately, white people are more receptive to being challenged by somebody who shares their experience. And I absolutely see and understand the frustration and the resentment. I also have Black people say to me, we need you to do it. You do it. It opens up space for us to do it. So it's not across the board, that resentment, but but of course it is there. It's I would feel it if a man was speaking about sexism. On the one hand, they need to be speaking to each other about sexism. I would be happy for that, and I could get a little resentful too. I don't know that there's a way out of that. What I do think it's important, because sometimes these sound bites can sound, very compelling. Over the last 5 years, there have been 32 books on the New York Times best-selling list on race, and 29 of them were written by Black people. Only 3 were written by white people, one of them being mine. And some of those books that were written by Black people, Brian Stevenson, Beverly Tatum, Michelle Alexander, they've been on the list much longer than my book. So it's simply not true that people aren't also listening to Black writers.
And, just the last question for you, or last couple of questions I have for you is what do you want the takeaway to ultimately be? You talked earlier about, what we're seeing now, the aftermath of George Floyd. There was this sense of urgency to address systemic racism. And now, as you said, some of those same people that were so urgent, in May, June, July of last year have, retreated. They're back to business as usual. What are you hoping that your second book does, particularly for those people who thought this was important last year, but now have decided, the value of their stock is back to being more important than addressing systemic racism? Yeah.
I hope what they get is the challenge to complacency. We can never be complacent. Following that, so-called uprising on the part of white people in the summer of 2020, look where we are. We're seeing voter suppression. I'm not even sure it was this harsh this Voting Rights Act. We are seeing literal laws that say you can't acknowledge racism exists. We're seeing laws being suggested that you can't teach about the civil rights movement. So this is where the courage comes in. It's exciting to rush down and march in a march. In a lot of ways, it doesn't take the kind of risk and courage that it takes to keep pushing this to stay on the table. What I want white people to take from this book is your work is not finished. Stay in the struggle. Don't be complacent. We can always do better. We won't get it right by everybody, but we can get it a little more right. And cause less harm. Let's cause less harm.
Yeah, do no harm. I love that. Just last question for you. Help us, Black people who are struggling. There were a lot of conversations. We talked about allies and white people asking Blacks, what can they do? Like, what can I do? There were people posting reading lists and, giving folks tips. There were books written by Black folks on how to be a better ally, how to be, an ally in this fight for social justice. Give us a couple of tips on what we can say to someone who genuinely, a white person who, genuinely wants to be a part of this solution, wants to really, play some part in dismantling these systems of racism that, have been pervasive throughout our history in this country.
I might say I'm going to offer you a question for reflection, and that is, in 2021, why don't you know what to do? Why is that your question in 2021 when incredible resources are everywhere, when Black people have been telling us forever, when you could Google it right now like you would Google anything else you wanted an answer to? What has enabled you not to know? And that's meant to be a challenge, but it's also sincere. Take out a piece of paper and make a list, and that will be your guide. There won't be anything on that list that you can't address. Nothing will be easy or quick, but you can address it. And I'm starting to wonder, because I get that question so often, I'm not really sure how sincere it is, to be honest. And I'm starting to wonder if what white people are really asking is, how do I challenge this with absolute no risk whatsoever while remaining comfortable and having everybody else around me remain comfortable? And I'm not sure that's
performative. Possible. We've been using performative a lot. How do I look like I'm engaged? Yes. And I care about it while maintaining and protecting the status quo?
Yeah. Right. So I would direct them to think deeply about what has prevented them so far and how can they change that.
Well, great answer, Dr. DiAngelo. Thank you so much. Again, her groundbreaking work, White Fragility, and her new book, Nice Racism, How Progressive White People Perpetuate Racial Harm, both the must-read books for white people and, like I said, Black people, so much that we can learn from reading and following the work that she does. Just a pleasure to sit down with you.
Thank you so much, Areva.
Absolutely. Take care, my friend.
Okay.
I want to thank my guest, Dr. Robin DiAngelo, again for sitting down with me. It's such a treat for me. I followed her work for years. So to be able to pick her brain and really talk to her about her two books that are truly groundbreaking on issues of race and social justice was a real treat for me. And I hope that all of you got as much out of this interview as I did. And I hope you go out and pick up her books. They are really life-changing. You've seen Jane Elliott on the show. I've had a chance to sit down with Peggy McIntosh. There are white people out here doing the work of social justice, and as Dr. DiAngelo said, they're not trying to, replace Black scholars who are doing this work. They're just trying to add their perspective, and of course, we always need to hear from the insiders. So I just thank her for the work that she's doing, and I'm going to end the show with some words to live by, a brief passage from her book, a passage that really resonated with me. And so I know lots of folks have been hating on Dr. DiAngelo, but I wanted her to be here in a safe place because this work is so important, and it's so important to me in the work that I do as a civil rights lawyer. So here are my words to live by. And this is from her book, Nice Racism. This is on page 15. Here's the passage. Nice racism results in personal complacency toward anti-racist efforts while upholding material consequences. We won't work toward systemic change if we don't even recognize, much less acknowledge, that we play a role one way or the other. That role either implicitly supports or explicitly challenges systemic racism. Policies don't write and enact themselves. Policies don't write and enact themselves. I think she was speaking directly to legislators, those legislators that have marched with Dr. King, those that have marched with John Lewis, those that consider themselves woke, those that say they're fighting for policies that impact the lives of poor and marginalized people, particularly Black and brown people. She's challenging them to reflect on what it means to be anti-racist and what it means to enact anti-racist policies. Because as Dr. DiAngelo says, policies don't write themselves. People do. I'm out. Y'all be safe out there. Don't forget to wear your mask, and don't forget we are all in this together.